Something is missing. You can feel it, but you cannot locate it. You have looked everywhere the world told you to look, in the relationship, in the career, in the achievement, in the approval, in the accumulation of experiences that were supposed to add up to something. And the feeling persists. Not pain exactly, not sadness in the way sadness has a face and a cause. Something more structural than that. A hollowness that sits at the center of your daily experience like a room with no furniture, present in the background of your best moments and your worst ones with equal indifference, unmoved by circumstances, untouched by success, impervious to every solution you've attempted. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying this feeling, and what he concluded was not that something is wrong with you. What he concluded was that something is wrong with the life specifically, with the distance between the life you are living and the life your psyche is actually built to live. That distance is not abstract, it has a mechanism, and once you understand the mechanism, the emptiness stops being mysterious and starts being a precise diagnostic signal pointing at something you can actually address. Jung's starting point was a claim that the modern world has never fully absorbed, and still largely refuses to accept that the human psyche is not a blank slate shaped entirely by experience and environment, not a passive receiver of external input that simply reflects whatever the world pours into it. The psyche has an internal structure, an architecture, a set of drives and orientations and developmental imperatives that are native to it, that exist prior to experience, and that require specific conditions to unfold correctly. Chief among those imperatives is the drive toward what Jung called individuation, the lifelong movement towards psychological wholeness, toward the full actualization of the self, toward becoming, as completely as possible, everything that you actually are, rather than the carefully edited version of yourself that you've presented to the world since childhood. When that drive is honored, when the conditions exist for the self to develop and express and integrate, the psyche generates something Jung described as a sense of meaning, not happiness in the shallow sense, not the absence of difficulty, but a quality of aliveness, of genuine engagement with existence that makes even suffering feel purposeful. When that drive is blocked, when the conditions don't exist, when the self is suppressed and the persona is substituted, and the authentic developmental process is short-circuited by the demands of conformity and approval and social survival, the psyche generates exactly what you are feeling right now. The emptiness is not a mystery. It is the experiential signature of a self that is not being lived. It is what wholeness feels like from the inside when it is absent. Most people's first response to the feeling is to treat it as a consumption problem. Something needs to be added: a new relationship, a new job, a new city, a new hobby, a new purchase, a new identity assembled from the available cultural options. The logic is intuitive: if something feels missing, find the missing thing and insert it. But Jung's clinical observation, repeated across decades of work with patients whose emptiness persisted through every external acquisition and arrangement they attempted, was that the feeling is not generated by absence of input. It is generated by absence of self. And you cannot fill an absence of self with content. You can distract from it temporarily. You can layer enough stimulation over it to make it inaudible for stretches of time. But the moment the stimulation stops, the moment the noise of the day falls away and you are alone with your own experience, it is there. Unchanged. Patient. Waiting. This is one of the most consistent features of the emptiness. Jung documented its immunity to distraction. Every other psychological state is movable by circumstance. Sadness can be temporarily lifted. Anxiety can be temporarily soothed. But this particular hollowness has a quality of permanence, of structural presence, that distinguishes it from ordinary emotional fluctuation. It is there in the morning before you have done anything to deserve it. It is there at the end of the best day you've had in months. It is there in the middle of experiences that are objectively pleasurable, inserting itself between you and the enjoyment. Like a layer of glass, you can see the pleasure. You can intellectually register that this is the kind of moment that should feel meaningful, but you cannot quite reach it. Jung would tell you that the glass is real. The layer of separation you feel between yourself and your own experience is not imagination, and it is not ingratitude, and it is not a chemical imbalance that can be corrected from the outside. It is the persona, the social mask, the constructed identity, the performance of self that you have been maintaining so consistently and for so long that it has become the only self you consciously know. And the persona, by definition, is not you. It is the version of you that was shaped by what others needed you to be. It is the identity that emerged from the systematic reinforcement of what was approved and the systematic suppression of what wasn't. From the earliest years of your life, you were engaged in an unconscious negotiation with the people and systems around you. learning which parts of yourself produced connection and safety, and which parts produced rejection and discomfort. The parts that produced connection got developed. The parts that produced rejection got buried. Over years, over decades, the buried parts accumulated into what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything you are that you decided, at some point, you were not allowed to be. And the shadow is not inert. This is the part that most people misunderstand. They think of the suppressed self as simply gone, as material that was set aside and dissolved, as a developmental path not taken that has no ongoing presence. Jung's entire clinical experience contradicted this completely. The shadow is alive. It is active. It is generating pressure constantly, pressing upward against the persona, trying to reintegrate, trying to return the psyche to the wholeness it is designed to move toward. And when that pressure has nowhere to go, when the persona is rigid enough and the suppression thorough enough that the shadow material cannot surface directly, it finds indirect expression. It becomes the inexplicable sadness, the sourceless anxiety, the chronic restlessness, the sense of going through motions, the feeling, persistent and precise, that something essential is missing. Because something essential is missing. It is missing from your conscious life because you put it there. Not maliciously, not stupidly. You put it there because you were a child navigating a social environment with the only tools available to you, and the tools required you to edit yourself in order to belong. But the edited material did not disappear. It went underground. And the emptiness you feel is, in significant part, the sensation of living as a fraction of yourself, of operating from the persona while the rest of you waits in the shadow, generating a gravitational pull toward wholeness that you experience as longing without object, as hunger without identifiable food, as the feeling that something is wrong that you cannot name, because what is wrong is the absence of a self you don't consciously remember having. There is a second mechanism Jung identified that feeds directly into the emptiness, and it operates at a layer deeper than the personal. He called it the collective unconscious, the inherited psychological substrate that underlies individual experience, the layer of the psyche that is not constructed by personal history, but is shared across the entire human species. Within the collective unconscious live what Jung called archetypes, primordial patterns of experience, universal templates for meaning-making, fundamental structures of human psychological life that have been active in every culture across all of recorded history. The hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self, the wise old man, the great mother. These are not literary inventions. They are psychological realities, structural features of the human mind that require activation and engagement in order for life to feel genuinely meaningful. Prior to modernity, these archetypal needs were met by the structures that organized human life by myth, by ritual, by religion, by initiation, by the stories a culture told about who its people were and what their lives were for. These structures were not merely decorative, they were psychologically functional. They provided a framework within which individual experience could be located within a larger pattern of meaning, within which suffering had a purpose and transitions had a form, and the journey of a human life had a shape that made sense. Modernity systematically dismantled those structures without replacing their psychological function. The myths were demythologized. The rituals were secularized into empty ceremony. The initiations were replaced by bureaucratic milestones, graduation, employment, marriage that marked transitions on paper without doing anything to facilitate the psychological transformation those transitions require. The result, which Jung identified with striking prescience decades before it became the defining condition of contemporary life, is a population that is materially more comfortable than any in human history and psychologically more adrift, more empty, more fundamentally unmoored than perhaps any before it. Because the archetypal needs didn't disappear when the structures that met them were dismantled. They went underground, exactly as the personal shadow goes underground, and they express themselves in the same way as a nameless hunger, a structural dissatisfaction, a feeling that something is fundamentally missing from experience that no available option seems to address. You feel empty not only because your personal self has been suppressed, but because the deeper layer of your psychological life, the archetypal layer, the layer that requires myth and meaning and genuine initiation and participation in something larger than individual accumulation, has been starved. The modern world is extraordinarily good at producing stimulation and extraordinarily bad at producing meaning. It offers an infinite supply of content and an almost total absence of the structures that allow content to cohere into a life that feels like it matters. And the psyche, which is not designed for stimulation but for meaning, registers this absence as emptiness. This is why the emptiness persists through achievement. Achievement in the modern sense is almost entirely persona-level activity. It is about performing competence, accumulating social proof, securing position in hierarchies of status and productivity. None of this engages the deeper layers of the psyche. None of it requires you to confront the shadow, to integrate the unlived parts of yourself, to engage with the archetypal dimensions of your experience, to participate in anything that the unconscious registers as genuinely meaningful. You can achieve continuously, prolifically, impressively, and the deeper layers of the psyche will remain entirely untouched, generating emptiness with the same reliability as before, because the activity taking place at the surface has no relationship to what those layers require. Jung's clinical work identified what those layers do require, and it is both simpler and more demanding than the modern world is comfortable acknowledging. They require honesty, genuine, sustained, uncomfortable engagement with the full reality of who you are, including the parts you have suppressed, and the parts you would prefer not to find. They require what Jung called a confrontation with the unconscious, a deliberate, disciplined turning of attention toward the inner life, toward the dreams and the impulses and the projections and the irrational reactions that the ego dismisses as noise, but that the unconscious generates as signal. They require shadow work, the actual process of locating what you buried, understanding why you buried it, and beginning the slow and frequently uncomfortable process of bringing it back into conscious life. Not to act on everything indiscriminately, not to tear down every structure that the ego built, but to restore the wholeness that chronic suppression destroyed, to close the gap between the self that is lived and the self that is real. And they require meaning, not the meaning that is assigned by external authority, not the meaning that comes from performing a role well or accumulating the right credentials, but the kind of meaning Jung described as discovered rather than invented, the meaning that emerges when a person is genuinely aligned with their own nature, genuinely engaged with the actual content of their inner life, genuinely moving toward the wholeness that the self is always pressing toward. When those conditions begin to be met, not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, the emptiness changes character. It does not vanish immediately. It does not transform overnight into some opposite of itself, but it begins to lose its quality of permanence, its structural inevitability, its sense of being built into the architecture of experience. It begins to feel less like a fundamental condition and more like a signal that has been heard, and a signal that has been heard does not need to keep broadcasting at the same volume. The hunger begins to have an object. The longing begins to have a direction. The glass between you and your own experience begins to thin, not because the external world has changed, but because the internal world has been engaged, because the self doing the living, and the self that was always waiting beneath the performance have begun, for the first time, to move toward each other. Jung understood the emptiness not as a pathology to be eliminated, but as a vocation. A calling from the deeper layers of the psyche toward the life that is actually yours. Not the life you were handed, not the life you constructed to satisfy the expectations of people whose approval you needed at an age when you had no alternative. Not the life that looks correct from the outside while feeling hollow from the inside. The life that requires your shadow as much as your persona, your darkness as much as your light, your full complexity as much as your curated surface. The life in which you are not managed but inhabited. The emptiness is not your enemy. It is the most honest communication your psyche knows how to make. It is the self, speaking in the only language the ego cannot rationalize away, telling you with absolute precision that the distance between where you are and where you are supposed to be has become too large to ignore. What you do with that communication, whether you reach for another distraction or turn, finally, toward what is generating the signal, is the only question that has ever actually mattered. And what that turning reveals, what waits in the territory the ego has spent years convincing you not to enter, is not what you have been afraid of finding. It is what you have been afraid of becoming.